Welcome to another episode of Writing Daily, the show that talks about writing daily. Anyway, I'm your host, Devin Galaudet. I'm the author of 10,000 Miles with My Dead Father's Ashes and the editor-in-chief of In the Know Traveler. Today, we are discussing why we sucks. Anyway, we is a voicing, and it happens all the time. And this is really sort of a pet peeve of mine. I've discussed it many times before on online, and somehow I've managed to avoid it up until now. But I want to discuss. I think perhaps as an editor, perhaps my biggest pet peeve is somebody will submit an article. And by the way, I'm grateful for all of the submissions that we receive. But one of the things that people tend to do is write in we voice. And the idea being is that I went on this trip and Sue happened to be with me, or Larry happened to be with me. So everything I'm going to now write is in we voice. And there's some significant problems with it. I'm going to discuss that. We're also going to talk a little bit about some examples of where you can get into obscure writing and it totally works, or obscure voicing and it totally works. Caitlin, welcome today. Thanks for joining. And so I think perhaps the most obvious main problem is that when we talk about we're very limited about what we can write about effectively. In other words, we can say we had a good time, but we can't necessarily talk about what our thoughts are per se, because it gets a little kludgy that way, because you can speak for yourself easily enough. And perhaps if you're writing fiction in an omniscient, third person voice, you can talk about what Larry and Sue are thinking, but really you can't necessarily do that unless you start introducing dialogue or some sort of sense where, yes, Larry told me what he was feeling, and so that's why we thought this. But it becomes cumbersome, and I don't know why anybody wants to do it, but they tend to do that all the time. And more importantly, I have, don't do this on my submission guidelines because it's kind of a drag when people write that way, but they insist on doing it because I think there's a sense that if I include Larry on the trip, or I don't include Larry on a trip, I'm giving a disservice to the story that I'm writing about my travel article, right? Big tip. And by the way, I am totally not the only person who does this. Brioni, welcome. Good to see you. It's been forever. So here's my tip. If you are going to be sending out a travel writing article to really any major publication, they're not going to publish your article that's written totally in we voice. It just makes no sense. It's something that I delete immediately. Occasionally, if we like the story, we will then go back and say, hey, if you consider to write this in first person and present your story in a first person, voicing, we would be happy to reconsider. But if you're writing in third person, and I've gotten many responses as, well, Larry was with me, so I have to include him, as if there was some measure of it's an homage. My travel article is now an homage to this person that happened to be in the room. Now, by the way, I would say that there are a few exceptions to that rule. First off, if you're just an incredible writer, you can pull it off. Most people cannot. Also, if the other person that is included in the story is very significant. In other words, you're like, I went to Tibet and there was the Dalai Lama. That's a conversation. Then I think we do write in we voice. But really, I think what I would probably end up doing is write in first person and then talk about my observations of being with the Dalai Lama and try to quote him as often as possible. So, but that said, I probably wouldn't write in a we voice. I have yet in the last 14 years of doing this I've received thousands and thousands of articles and submissions over that time. I have never seen somebody write in we voice where it was effective or interesting or couldn't be better put in a different voicing. So that's something to consider. That all said, I have to say there was something. Now, I've still never found a good writer presenting we voice. As a matter of fact, I don't even think I've ever really seen it. So basically, we voice is kind of first person plural. I didn't find a good example of that, but I did, however, in this fantastic book by Richard Yates, who's probably the best writer you have never heard of. In his book, Revolutionary Road, he's much more familiar now after the movie came out. But honestly, I think before the movie, it was really just kind of like, he was like a guy that you would talk about in an MFA program. But he's a wonderful writer. He writes lots of young at heart. Anyway, he's got a number of books. They're in the other room. He has a series of short stories. He's an incredibly talented writer, and just to read his writing is beautiful. So I'm going to give you this kind of odd thing that he does, and I don't think I've read it anywhere else, but he kind of goes with a they voice. And I believe he pulls it off. So I want to at least give you an example. If you insist on writing in we voice, I want to give you encouragement to keep trying, because something like this would be like, wow, this is beautiful. So this is at the beginning of Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates. The final dying sounds of their dress rehearsal left the laurel players with nothing to do but stand there, silent and helpless, blinking out over the footlights of an empty auditorium. They hardly dared to breathe as the short, solemn figure of their director emerged from the naked seats to join them on stage, as he pulled the stepladder raspingly from the wings and climbed halfway up its rungs to turn and tell them, with several clearings of his voice, that they were a damned talented group of people and a wonderful group of people to work with. And then the director goes into some dialogue, which is not helping my point. So I'm gonna skip over that. They could have wept with relief. Instead, trembling, they cheered and laughed and shook hands and kissed one another, and somebody went out for a case of beer, and they all sang songs around the auditorium piano until the time to agree unanimously that they'd better knock it off and get a good night's sleep. So that is one of the rare occurrences where I've seen sort of like a really obscure thing work. I remember writing a story in an MFM program that was sort of like a omniscient second person, meaning you did this and you did that. And I assumed a lot of things. I got torn to shreds by a very traditional professor, really super smart guy. Wanted nothing of it. I ended up putting in first person, regretted it. It wasn't great, and I still think I should fight through it. But, it's really tricky when we get into like you voice, we voice, those kind of things that you don't hear very often. They kind of don't ring right in the ear. A good example of somebody who writes a lot of short stories in second person voice, just in case you are interested on what you voice really sounds like when it's done well, is, oh shoot, where's her? I brought her book out so I wouldn't forget. Did I put it? Oh, there was the writer of Birds of America, a woman named Lori Moore. She put out a book called Self-Help. And that was, I think, is probably about as good a second person voice as you could possibly see. As always, if you're checking me out and you like what I'm doing, talking about writing, please consider hitting the like button here. It will make my day springtimey, and it will let me know that I'm moving on the right track in terms of talking about writing. And so that's what we're doing today. I actually have a busy day. I'm going to be heading into Los Angeles, see some family. Then I'm having a late lunch with a dear close friend. And then it's actually going to be guys' night. So anyway, it's going to be a fun time. I look forward to talking to more with you about writing. So I'm looking forward to seeing you guys soon. And as always, writing daily is just what we do. That's what we do as writers. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And thanks so much for joining me today. Much appreciated.